Despair does not always announce itself with screams. Most often it walks in softly, dressed in routine, concealed beneath the weight of normalcy. It doesn't strike like lightning. It settles like dust. And yet for Søren Kierkegaard, despair is not an affliction to be avoided at all costs. It is, paradoxically, a threshold, the beginning of something deeper. Not the end of life, but the first true confrontation with it. For it is in despair that a person ceases to live as a shadow among shadows and begins to sense the infinite ache of the self. We are creatures of habit and expectation. We build our identities upon roles, relationships, and achievements. We rely on the tangible, the predictable, the visible. But when those scaffolds begin to crack, when a loss, a failure, a silence shakes the foundation, we do not just mourn the event, we mourn ourselves. We feel the crumbling not just outside us, but within. Kierkegaard called this the sickness unto death, not death of the body, but death of the connection to the eternal. A soul that forgets itself, that flees from itself, or that despairs of ever becoming itself. This is the real suffering. And strangely, the ones who suffer most are not always those who appear broken. Some carry their despair beneath success, laughter, or even competence. Despair wears many masks, and the most dangerous of them is the one that smiles. But for Kierkegaard, despair is not failure. It is an invitation. It is the call of the eternal self, pressing against the cage of the constructed self. When you despair, something ancient and silent within you is knocking, not to destroy you, but to awaken you, to remind you that your essence does not lie in what can be taken, lost, or measured. You are more than your circumstances, more than your story, more than your fear. Yet this awakening is not painless. It begins as anguish. It feels like collapse, like standing at the edge of a void and hearing no answer. And it is here, precisely here, that the leap becomes possible. Not a leap into optimism or empty belief, but into something far more sacred. Faith born in darkness. The faith that does not deny despair, but walks through it. The faith that recognizes the absurd, that nothing makes sense, and yet something deeper compels you to trust anyway. Kierkegaard understood. Despair is not the enemy. It is the moment when life ceases to be entertainment and becomes a question. And the one who dares to live that question, trembling, uncertain, awake, is already on the path. Because only those who descend into themselves can ever hope to rise. When despair reaches its peak, it reveals its cruel illusion, that there is nothing left to reach for. It tells you the story has ended, that your efforts were futile, that you are stranded in a world where no help is coming and no meaning remains. But this is precisely where Kierkegaard's philosophy takes its most dramatic turn, for he insists that this is not the end at all. It is a beginning masquerading as an ending, a birth cloaked in the garments of death. This moment, the moment when the soul sees no light, no hope, no exit, is what Kierkegaard calls the point of paradox. Logic has failed. Human reasoning can no longer carry the burden of meaning. The scaffolding of explanation collapses. And what remains is the stark, absurd tension. I exist, but I do not know why. Here, one might expect annihilation. But Kierkegaard offers something far more radical. The leap. The leap is not a movement of the mind, but of the spirit. It is not calculated, not safe, not provable. It is the act of throwing oneself into the arms of the eternal, not because the eternal can be grasped, but precisely because it cannot. It is the soul's cry. I do not understand, but I trust. I am not certain, but I step forward. This is where the spiritual life begins, not in blind obedience or moral certainty, but in the trembling faith that something beyond despair holds the self together. The leap is absurd, yes, but it is not irrational. It is deeper than reason. It is reason reaching its limit, bowing its head, and letting the heart speak. To make this leap is to stand naked before the infinite, without guarantees, without answers, without proof, and still, to believe. Kierkegaard was clear. This is not optimism. Faith is not the denial of suffering. It is the acceptance of suffering without surrender. It is the willingness to face the abyss and say, even if I fall into the hands of God. But this kind of faith does not come in comfort. It is born only in despair. Only in the death of self-assurance can this deeper self, this eternal self, begin to stir. And so the soul, having exhausted all exits, now stands before the invisible threshold, not one made of stone or fire, but of silence. The silence of God, the silence of the unknown. You cannot see what lies beyond, but you are invited to leap anyway. This is not weakness. This is the greatest strength a human can summon. To continue without clarity, to trust without answers, to believe without vision. And in this absurd act, this sacred madness, a new self is born, a self no longer enslaved to despair, because it has already walked through it. What remains after the leap? This is the question that trembles beneath every act of faith. Not whether we will survive despair, but who we become after it. For Kierkegaard, the soul that passes through despair and still dares to believe is not simply restored, it is remade. It becomes whole, not because the storm ceased, but because it discovered an anchor that no storm can reach. Before the fall, we are fragmented, pulled by the world's voices, shaped by public opinion, defined by status, expectation, habit. We wear borrowed selves, play acceptable roles. Even our joys are often distractions from the deeper silence calling within. But despair breaks these masks. It confronts us with a terrifying clarity. I am not yet myself. And so we begin again, not by rebuilding what was lost, but by awakening to what was always waiting. A self not based on outward stability, but rooted in eternity, in the presence of God, not as a concept, but as a living reality, a relationship, a knowing beyond knowing. This self does not deny the pain it passed through. It remembers it, it honors it, but it is no longer ruled by it, because it has encountered something stronger than pain, the eternal yes beneath every apparent no. Kierkegaard speaks of the knight of faith, not a heroic figure in armor, but an inward warrior, one who walks the streets like everyone else, unnoticed, ordinary. And yet, inwardly, they have made the leap. They have died to the world's despair, and now live in quiet communion with the Absolute. This is not escape, it is incarnation. It is living in the same world, among the same troubles, yet with a spirit no longer crushed by them. It is not that life becomes easier, but it is no longer everything. The eternal has entered time, and the soul walks with it. This transformation is not loud, it does not need applause, it simply is. And once it happens, you no longer fear the silence. You are no longer paralyzed by uncertainty, because you have seen that meaning does not come from understanding. It comes from relationship, not with the world, but with the source. Despair, then, was never the end. It was the purification. It burned away the superficial so the essential could emerge. It tore down the scaffolding so the foundation could be revealed. And in that sacred stillness, after all has fallen, the soul discovers it was held all along. Not by logic, not by achievement, but by the quiet, unfailing hand of the eternal. This is what remains after the leap. A new self, a deeper freedom, a faith that no longer asks to see, because it knows. And now it walks, not ahead of the darkness, but through it, and it is no longer afraid. We are all at some point brought to the edge of ourselves, and when that moment comes, when the familiar collapses and the soul trembles before the silence, it is not punishment, nor failure, nor fate. It is an invitation, to see not with the eyes but with the heart, to trust not in answers but in presence, to live not with certainty but with courage. Kierkegaard did not promise relief from despair. He offered something far more enduring, a path through it, a path that begins where human strength ends and where divine intimacy begins. So if you are standing at the edge, do not fear the fall. There is a hand beneath you that does not tremble. There is a self within you that cannot die. And there is a voice, quiet but steady, that says, "Leap and live."